Welcome to Roots Tech and welcome to a walk through the Big Y. My name is Casimir and I'm a Big Y specialist with FamilyTreeDNA. Today I'll be explaining how to look at your Big Y results as demonstrated by walking you through my own, as I would for a customer, with emphasis on the block tree, Big Y matching, and how to do time to most recent common ancestor estimates. Thank you for watching. And just briefly, these are the relevant buttons on the dashboard. You can either go to Results and Tools or on the dashboard itself, the YDNA Results and Tools section. But there's the YSTR markers under Matching under DNA Matches, the block tree, the Big Y Matches, the Big Y Results page for SNPs, and the YSTR Results. With the Big Y 700, if you do not already have Y111 testing, then these results will be included with your order when you order a Big Y. With YSTR marker testing like the Y111, 67, 37, and so on, the higher the number of STR markers that you have in common at the lowest genetic distance, these are going to be your closest matches. In addition to the first Y111 markers, in addition to the first 111 STR markers that we provide matching for, the Big Y also tests an additional 700 or so Big Y STR markers. YDNA, the Big Y and SNP marker testing. The Big Y 700 tests SNP markers, which whenever a son has a new SNP mutation that his father did not have and his brothers wouldn't have, this new SNP will act as the off-on switch for that new branch of the YDNA haplotree or YDNA human family tree. The Big Y tests 23.6 million base pairs, or the whole haplotree worth of SNPs, to take you from your main branch of the YDNA haplotree down to your most recent twig, which gives you your terminal SNP and or refined haplogroup. Then, with the Big Y block tree, you can count how many SNPs back in time on the haplotree it is to where you and any other Big Y tester branch off from each other, and use that to get a time to most recent common ancestor estimate. It is important to note that if you get the Big Y, no additional SNP tests are necessary. If you have any questions about whether or not you tested a SNP, you can look in the Big Y results page and actually look up that SNP to confirm it. So once you get the Big Y, you don't need to get a SNP pack or a SNP test, because you have almost certainly already tested that SNP. And lastly, the Big Y also tests an additional 700 or so Big Y STR markers, in addition to that first 111 that we provide matching for. And here let's take a look at my Y111 STR marker matches. You can see that I'm matching these two gentlemen. We've got our cousin here who we're matching at the Y111 level. You can see at a genetic distance of 4. And then our more distant relative we're matching at also at the Y111 at a genetic distance of 10. So 4 out of 111, that means we're matching him on 100, and the closer cousin we're matching on 107 out of 111 STR markers, whereas our more distant relative matching him on 101 out of 111 markers. You can also see that under each tester's name, my closer cousin has taken a Y111, and our more distant relative has taken a Big Y700. And that means that there's no Big Y STR results available for our closer cousin, and but there are for my more distant relative. And you can also see that his terminal SNP has changed from the one you would get from a Y37 or 111 from that test. You'd usually get a RM198 if you're in R1A, but he has taken a big Y, so he has a different terminal SNP there. And if you ever see somebody who has a different terminal SNP, but you look and see that they've not taken anything higher than a Y111, they don't have a big Y, then that means they've taken individual SNP tests or a SNP pack. So let's continue. This is our YSTR marker time to most recent common ancestor chart, developed by our population geneticist to replace the old tip finder tool. And looking at this chart in reference to our last two matches, my cousin who we're matching, so this is technically my dad's kit, so that's why I'm saying we're. So we're matching at a Y111 at genetic distance of 4. So that gives an average of 283 years before present, with a range out to about 553 years before present, 100, about 100 to about 550. I happen to know that our match is a little bit on the nearer side of that. So, and then we've got my cousin who I'm matching at Y111 genetic distance of 10. If we were matching any further, that would be beyond the Y111 matching criteria. So the estimate for him, it averages out to about 653 years before present, with a range from about 237 to 1275 years before present. And 600, where'd we go? 22 minus 653 comes out to about 1369 AD, which is just about where we're looking, give or take, to find our common ancestor between us and our more distant cousin. One reason why the big Y700 is so handy is that with YSTR marker testing, occasionally you run into something called convergence, and this is where the STR markers of people from two different lineages mutate into each other's path, so to speak, so that they end up matching each other even though they're not genetically related. Maybe they have a common ancestor a couple thousand years ago, but the STR markers just ended up mutating such that they match each other. And there's also divergence, the opposite, where the STR markers mutate more rapidly than you would expect, and people who you would think would match each other do not. And this is more common, convergence is more common at the lower STR marker levels like Y12 and 25, but you can occasionally even see this at the Y111 level, especially in some branches of the haplotree. If you want to definitively know whether or not somebody's from the same patrilineal line as you, the big Y700 is the way to do it, since with the big Y you're either positive for that SNP on that branch of the haplotree or you're not. So when you get your big Y, where do you go to view your results? The block tree is usually the best and first place to look, because that's where you're going to see who's on the same branch as you, who's on branches that are close to you, and how close you're matching. And also on the block tree you can see what SNPs you're positive for. Then you can go see your big Y matches for more information about your matches, and you can look at the non-matching variance between you. If you need to double check any of your SNPs, you can do that in big Y results. And then you can also compare your YSTR marker matches from the lower level, like the Y111, to compare that time to most recent common ancestor estimate to that of the big Y. If you have to pick between the two, I go with the time to most recent common ancestor from the SNP markers, but that doesn't mean that comparing them is not useful. And then lastly, you can share and compare your additional big Y STR markers with your big Y matches if you wish to do so for further analysis. An important note, when your big Y test completes in the lab and your results post, we'll place you as far down the haplotree as we can place you, but it usually takes a week or two for our phylogenetic expert to go through and check the reads and make any updates to the haplotree and your branch of the haplotree from the information we learned. So in the meantime, we appreciate your patience. This is the big Y block tree. The block tree is a representation of the Y-DNA haplotree that shows how many SNPs are on each branch of the haplotree, which then you can use to get an estimate of how far back in time your most recent common ancestor was with any other big Y tester. The blue blocks are the branches of the haplotree showing how many SNPs are in each branch. There's no significance to the dark blue one being dark blue, other than that's the one at the top of the page. But you can follow those branches, the blue blocks, down to the white block is the block of your terminal SNP and your most recent common ancestor. And then the green blocks are of private variants, which private variants they're like unnamed SNPs. They're mutations that so far only one person has tested positive for and no one else has. So you can imagine that the green blocks are an average of the number of SNPs that each tester has who's under that terminal SNP. This is the same picture of the block tree, except I had clicked that little up arrow that I've got a little blue arrow pointing to on the bar at the top of the page to go up a branch, and you can actually keep clicking that and go all the way up the haplotree to the top of your haplogroup, which if you look over on the top right, there's a line of SNPs. In this case, it's starting with M207, which is haplogroup R, then it goes M173, which is R1, and then M420 is R1A. And if you go down 2 SNPs from there, it goes to M198, which is the predicted haplogroup you'd get from the Y37 or the Y111. As you can see with the big Y700, we've tested down several or many SNPs and branches all the way down to where we have enough space to start showing them on the block tree. And you can follow the long red arrow along the top from my haplogroup R, and then R1, R1A, and then you can follow the little red arrows once we get to the block tree, down the branches of the block tree. You can follow those little red arrows down the branches of the block tree from that top blue bar. The top block is BY29925 to RYP 5903 to RYP 5901 to RY 93482 down to FT 18688, and then down to my terminal SNP FT 163295. These new SNPs are formed every few generations or so. We use an average of every 80 years or so a new SNP is formed. So if you look at a block and it's got several SNPs in it, then that could be several hundred years. This block, my block with my terminal SNP has 7 SNPs in it, so 7 times 80, that could be 560 years there, give or take, where anybody who's tested positive for any of those SNPs has all of them. And then you can see below my block with my terminal SNP, there's a green bar that says private variance 9, private variance average of 9, and that average is between the private variance for myself, or technically my dad, the private variance for my distant relative, and private variance for the guy who is labeled match number 2. And these private variants I mentioned before, they're mutations that so far only one person has tested positive for and no one else has, because anytime two or more people test positive for the same private variant, then we know it's not a one-off mutation, and we can name it as a SNP and add it to the haplotree. So in fact, I have ordered a big Y, but it's not complete at time of recording, so I'm basing this off of my dad's big Y kit. But when my big Y comes back, I'll get put in R-FT163295, but then after give it a week or two for our phylogenetic expert to go through and check the results and make the updates, and then me find all of my dad's private variants that will be mutations that I have, and so we'll be able to name those as SNPs, add them to the haplotree, and we'll have a new branch under FT 163295. And that's how we build the haplotree. Likewise, the way within each individual block, like we'll look at the block with my terminal SNP there, we don't actually know which of those SNPs occurred first or last or in what order they occurred in, because anybody who has any of those SNPs within a given block has all of them. The way that we discover which SNPs occurred first is we get somebody who tests positive for some of the SNPs within a block, but not the rest of them. Then we know the ones that they tested positive for occurred first, and we split the block, and they would have their own line after the split, and the testers positive for the rest would be on the original line or the existing line. One last thing while we're here, you can see I had mentioned that the little blue arrow pointing to the upward arrow on the gray bar at the top of the screen, that can take you up the haplotree. You can also see that the block tree kind of goes off the page over on the right, and there is a little over arrow in a circle that you can click to take the screen over to the right. And also, if you go somewhere else on the haplotree and you need to get back to where you started, up in the top left corner there is a reset button. If you look over on the left hand side of the block tree, there's that SNP ruler that it's labeled 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and that is counting not years or generations, but it's counting how many mutations up to each block. And to use that to get a time to most recent common ancestor estimate with the block tree, the first thing we're going to need to do is click on the block of our most recent common ancestor to bring that to Tetris that over there and make it flush up against that SNP ruler. If I want to do the time to most recent common ancestor between myself and our distant relative here, that would be the bottom of our terminal SNPs block, RFT 163295. So we'll click on that block. And as you can see, now that we've clicked on the block of my most recent common ancestor with our distant relative over there, and also with match number 2, with that FT 163295 block has been brought over flush up against that SNP ruler, and then we can count up the number of SNPs and or private variants till we get to the bottom of the block of our most recent common ancestor, and that's see 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's 9 SNPs to the bottom of that block. With the big Y700, we use an estimate of a new SNP mutation every 80 years or so on average. With the older big Y500 that tested fewer SNPs, it was a new mutation every 140 years. But with the big Y700 that tests half as many again SNPs, there's the estimate we use is a new SNP mutation every 80 years or so. There's other estimates out there. Usually they're comparable to the 80 years one I'm using here, but in any case, let's look and count on the we've got the block flush up against that snip ruler. We've counted up the 9 SNPs, or in this case private variance average, and then we can multiply 9 SNPs times 80 years per SNP equals a time to most recent common ancestor estimate of 720 years before present. And for practice, let's do another one. Most of the people on my branch of the haplotree have their earliest known ancestor listed as being from Poland, but there is one guy here with that blue and yellow flag whose earliest known ancestor is from Sweden. And let's say I want to know the time to most recent common ancestor estimate between me and him. So we'll go up the block tree and find our most recent common ancestor where our lineages both meet, and that is at the RYP5901 block. So to get the estimate, we click on that block, and that brings that flush up against the SNP ruler and has everything as far down the block tree as it can go. And then we can count up the number of SNPs to the bottom of the block where our lines branch off from each other. So that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 22 SNPs and private variance back in time. So 22 SNPs times 80 years per SNP equals 1760 years before present. This is a work in progress, but one thing we are planning to do in the future is to add the time to most recent common ancestor and or SNP age estimates to the block tree itself to make it more convenient, and that way you don't have to pull out a calculator every time you want to use to do a time to most recent common ancestor estimate. The best estimate I've got for our most recent common ancestor with the Swedish tester at our common ancestor at YP5901 would be 12,000 years ago, 12,000 years before present, give or take, down from 1,760. So it's a little bit less. And the time to most recent common ancestor between my dad and our distant relative is roughly 650 years, give or take. 650, give or take 300 years. So that's also a little bit more recent, but it's still in the 1300s, as we suspected. This is the end of part 1 of our walk through the Big Y. Please proceed to part 2 for the rest of the presentation.